So today we'll be testing the AMD Radeon RX 580 in Cyberpunk 2077. Now if you have a look at our top left hand corner there, you'll see we've got our GPU metrics. The GPU is currently sitting at about 63 degrees Celsius. It's running at 100% usage. We've got our core clock speed and our power draw as well as the voltage. Then we've got our VRAM usage and the memory clock speed as well. And then we've got our CPU. Today we're pairing this with a 12400F, which is a 6-core 12-thread CPU. Then we've got the CPU usage as well as the CPU clock speed. Then below that we've got our memory usage, our DDR4 3200 CL16 memory, and then below that we've got the frame rate and the frame time graph. Now how we measure the performance is actually by checking the 1% and the 0.1% loads in conjunction with the average. Now I'm just going to reset these numbers here, and as you can see we are outside of Mega Building H10. And this is quite an intense area. This is outside of V's original apartment, and the reason why we test it here is because it is quite intensive on the CPU and GPU, and we can cause quite a little bit of mayhem here by just fighting. There's a lot of cops here, so we can see what the performance hit is when you start shooting. Alright, so currently we've got the settings at 1080p with the low preset. So what I do is I put it on low, and then you'll see that FSR is automatically enabled. So I just disable FSR. So it's the low preset with FSR disabled. Alright, so now we can start with our benchmark run. We'll reset the numbers, and you can see that I think FSR is on. We are getting about 60 frames per second, and this is not what we saw earlier. So that's the other thing about Cyberpunk. Even though FSR is disabled, we just enable it, hit apply, and then we can disable it again. Alright, now this time it should work. Right there you can see that our frames per second dropped by about 10. Right, so now we can start with our benchmark run, and moving around in this area, the frame rate does drop below 45. We are getting about 50 frames per second average. It's definitely not bad. We've got a pretty old GPU here. It was quite good for its generation. It was one of the stronger AMD GPUs of its time, and it competed with the GTX 1060 6GB. In Vulkan titles, the RX 580 would come out on top, but in normal Direct3D, OpenGL, etc., the 1060, they were pretty much neck and neck depending on which game you were playing. Alright, so as you can see, we're not hitting 50 frames per second. It's not ideal, but definitely not bad. The input lag is a little bit high. It is a little bit of a downside, especially seeing that this is a first-person shooter. Right, but let's see what happens once we start fighting. Right, so there we drop down to 42 frames per second. I didn't have any problems landing my headshots, but that's probably because my enemies were standing still. Right, so now, yeah, the real test comes when enemies are actually moving. So what we're testing here is the input latency. So the lower the input latency, the higher my accuracy should be, theoretically. I mean, that's how it works with normal players. Just not sure that applies to me. Alright, so, I mean, the game is definitely playable. It's still a good looking game. You can see that textures in the distance are not as high detail. If you look at signs in the distance, especially the further you move away from that particular sign, the fast food stall, you can see that the detail does drop off quite a bit, and as you come closer it looks pretty nice. Alright, so this is quite an intense gunfight here. We are losing. And we are averaging about 47 frames per second. So the next test I'm going to do is I'm just going to drive around a little bit, because driving around in this game is extremely intensive as well. Let's just see if we can survive long enough. We can't. So I'm just going to reload my save game and drive around. And it seems like my car is lost. Let's try that one again. It's showing me my car is way on the other side of the map here. Yeah, that's not ideal. So I guess we'll just have to steal somebody's car. Well, obviously the numbers were affected by me going back into the menu, but we had about a 45 frames per second average, and the 1% and 0.1% lows were proportionate to the average. Right, so as you can see, driving around, the FPS fluctuates quite a bit. The input latency is definitely a lot more noticeable while you are driving. The steering inputs are pretty laggy, and it makes for a terrible driving experience, actually. I mean, sure, I'm not the best driver in this game, but it just feels very, very sluggish. So I would say that your best bet would be to aim for 60 frames per second when playing this game. Alright, so this was at 1080p with the low preset and FSR disabled, so now we'll just go up to the medium preset and see what happens. Right, so we're at the medium preset, but I'm going to disable FSR anyway. The FSR tests will come just now, and we'll reset the numbers, and we've got about 35 frames per second here. This is a very cinematic feel. The driving is definitely a lot less responsive, even though we only dropped 10 to 15 frames per second. Percentage wise, that's about 30%, so it's quite a big influence on how the game is playing. Right, so moving around on foot, once again we are getting about 40 frames per second. I see that the preset does enable motion blur. That's probably just to try and smooth things over a little bit. It doesn't really help. I mean, it does look like we are watching a time lapse in 24 frames per second. Medium settings I would avoid, especially at the native resolution. We're not going to take too much of your time with the medium settings, and we'll move on to the ultra settings now. Alright, so now we're on the ultra quick preset. Once again, I am disabling FSR, and let's see what happens. Alright, so on ultra, let's just reset the numbers here. We dropped down another 10 frames per second, so basically we went from around 50 frames per second to around 40 frames per second by upping it to medium, and then from medium to ultra we dropped another 10-15 frames per second. I mean, the game looks very nice, but it does not play very nice. Once again, this is to be expected. I mean, this is one of the most demanding games. Even though this game is 2 years old, it's still one of the most demanding games even today. So to expect the RX 580 to give us high frame rates at these settings is unreasonable. Your expectations need to be realistic when you're playing with the older hardware, right? So as you can see, we are not getting a 30 frames per second average, and that hurts. But lying on the ground, we're getting 30 frames per second, so that's good. Alright, so this was at 1080p Ultra, and I would say avoid it, especially at native resolution. Alright, let's see what we can do at 1440p. Alright, we are now at 1440p, once again with the low quick preset and disabling FSR. Alright, so I'm going to reload my save so we can get a clean run. Alright, so right off the bat it seems like we are getting around 50 frames per second, which is weird because that's pretty much what we got at 1080p low with native resolution. So once again I am assuming that FSR settings did not apply. You can see FSR is disabled, so let's just enable it and disable it again. And let's see what our FPS does, and there you go. So now all of a sudden we are getting in the high 30s. Right, let's start our benchmark run, and I mean the game does look quite a lot better at 1440p than it does at 1080p, and it doesn't perform that much worse. Yeah, sure, we're getting between 12 and 15 frames per second less than at 1080p. The input latency is not terrible. It is definitely doable. I'm not sure how accurate our shooting would be. If you absolutely have to play this game at 1440p native, then I mean it's not a terrible experience. So we still have FSR to help us, and we'll test that as soon as we're done with the native testing. Right, it does get a little bit more difficult when there are more enemies to actually try and shoot them, especially with the input latency. I know it seems like I'm making excuses, but when you are used to playing at a little bit of a higher frame rate, I'd say 60 plus, the increase in input latency once you go below that is actually very noticeable. Right, so we are averaging just above 30 frames per second with our 1% and 0.1% lows numbers actually very respectable. I mean, these numbers are grouped very tightly together, and I think that's more testament to how this game actually improved over time. So that's a good thing. If you have an RX 580 GPU, then this game is definitely playable. Right, so this was at 1440p low preset with FSR disabled. So let's see how it does on medium. Alright, once again, just enabling and disabling FSR seems to fix the issue. And now we are getting 25 frames per second. Once again, a very cinematic experience this. Definitely not one I'd recommend, even though the game looks quite nice at these settings. The gameplay is definitely not that nice. Right, so the input latency while driving is extremely high. It's pretty difficult to drive at these lower frame rates. So I can just imagine what the Xbox One and PS4 players felt when they originally purchased this game at launch. And that's not a diss on console players, not at all. I also play on console, but this is pretty much the frame rate that the original PS4 and Xbox One users had back on launch, and my car is disabled and I died. Right, so we've got an average of about 25 frames per second. I don't think I'm going to try Ultra. We are going to be in the high teens. So let's just move on to 1080p low with FSR enabled. Alright, so here we are back at 1080p and we are using the low preset. I don't know why it's said custom, but we've got FSR on auto, and let's just see what happens. Right, so immediately you can see that we've got about 60 frames per second here. Let's run around a little bit, see if we can maintain that 60 frames per second. We will drop below 60 frames per second every now and again, but I reckon we'd be able to get at least 55 frames per second average with the lows pretty close to it. Right, so running around here, we are getting 60 frames per second more often than not, so that's actually pretty good. Right, so FSR is on auto, so I'm not exactly sure what setting it would be at. It might be quality, or it might be a lower internal resolution than quality. The game does look a little bit more blurry. Obviously these RX cards don't support DLSS, but FSR 2.1 comes pretty close in terms of performance gains and image quality. Sure, there are some games that prefer DLSS where ghosting is less obvious, and other games where AMD's FSR implementation actually looks a little bit better. Right, but in this game we've got a FSR 2.1, and I must say that there's not a lot of ghosting, especially in the crosshair. Usually that's one of the areas where you'd notice it the most is fast moving crosshairs, but this one seems to be doing okay. And you can see that we are actually getting our 60 frames per second average here. The input latency does feel much improved over the previous settings. As you can see, I'm actually landing some of my shots, but all right, let's drive around a bit. Let's see what the frame rate does. Can I get in this car? Right, so we're just going to drive around in the circle a little bit, go up the road there, try and make a U-turn, and I must say the car is definitely a lot easier to handle at higher frame rates, just purely due to reduced input latency, right? So, I mean, don't take my word for it, just look at my sublime driving. Right, so there you go, that's a perfect example. So driving around, we are still dropping below 60, even below 50 there. as I said, driving around is quite intensive in this game. So what we'll do is we'll see what FSR setting we have to use to maintain a solid 60 frames per second. And now we'll just test FSR on performance or balanced. Right, let's start with balanced first. Reset our numbers here. And you can see we got about a 10% increase in the frame rate, but our visual quality dropped quite a bit. It's still not terrible. The game still looks quite okay, and we are now getting pretty much 60 frames per second all of the time. Well, so far anyway. So let's see what happens once we start driving. I mean, my car is stuck in traffic, but driving around seems okay. We are dropping just below 60 frames per second, but I don't think that's anything to be too concerned about. As I said, this area is pretty intensive, and if we go up the road here a little bit, we should be able to maintain 60 frames per second at all times, except if we do that. I mean, that was a pretty good stunt, but yeah, as you can see, we are getting about 63 frames per second average, and the 1% and 0.1% lows are pretty close to it as well. Right, so let's see what the game looks like once we move to performance FSR. It doesn't look like we've gained much. Sure, well, now we're getting about 85 frames per second. The lights look okay if you look close enough, or if you stand close enough, but as you move away you can actually see that there's quite a lot of artifacting happening in these lights. Right, that's just the drawback of using upscaling tech. DLSS does exactly the same. So let's drive around a little bit. You can see that our FPS fluctuates quite a lot. It's between 60 and 90, and I don't think that this is actually ideal. You can see that we are definitely not CPU bound. Our GPU usage is sitting at 100% usage all the time. So it's pretty strange that our lowest numbers actually are more or less the same. I mean, dipping just below 60 frames per second, but our highs actually went up to 90s at times. That kind of FPS fluctuation would actually be quite annoying. So I would say that preferably you should play on balanced instead of performance, just to have a little bit of a more stable frame rate. As you can see, whilst driving, we are still dropping below 60 frames per second. So we didn't gain much with our average frames per second there. It's just the highs that increased quite a lot. Alright, so let's see what it looks like at Ultra Performance. Alright, we're at Ultra Performance, and the visual quality is actually very noticeable, the reduction in the visual quality. And once again, well, we are maintaining a little bit of a higher average here, but I wouldn't say that it's worth it for the trade-off. I mean, we got close to these numbers with DLSS, well, FSR Balanced. So I'd say stick to FSR Balanced if you play at 1080p with an RX 580. Once again, even with Ultra Performance, which lowers the internal resolution quite a lot, you can see that we are still GPU bound. Our 12400F CPU is keeping up quite nicely. So even at these lower internal resolutions, we are not CPU bound. The 1% low number, or the 0.1% low number there, took quite a bit of a hit again. I'm not exactly sure what that is. I know this game auto-saves every 5 minutes, so it might be that. So I just reset the numbers just to see if we can capture some accurate data whilst I'm performing some burnouts here. And I must say that at these frame rates, especially in this area, you'd notice that we've got about 10 frames per second higher than usual. The car does feel a little bit better to drive. I mean, just ignore that last crash, but yeah, so there you go. We've got an average of about 65 frames per second. Once again, pretty much the same as what we had on FSR Balanced. So going to performance and ultra performance, FSR definitely did not help our cores here. Our 1% and 0.1% low numbers also are pretty much the same. So there's no real benefit to reducing the quality by upping the FSR settings if you have an RX 580 that's paired with a CPU that can keep it GPU bound at all times. Alright, now let's see what we can do at 1440p. Alright, so now we're at 1440p with the low quick preset, so FSR is now enabled. Just reset the numbers here. I mean, there's a big difference in visual quality compared to our previous setting, 1080p with ultra performance, but there's also quite a big loss in performance. The game looks pretty nice though. Driving around in this area, the input latency is definitely noticeable as the FPS drops. I mean, that's to be expected, and once again, it's not really realistic to expect high frame rates, 60 plus frame rates from this RX 580 in Cyberpunk. So I would say that it is doing actually quite okay. Alright, but let's see what we need to do to be able to get 60 frames per second on 1440p. So right off the bat, I'm going to go to FSR Performance. Once again, we are still actually on the low preset, and just FSR Performance will be enabled. Right, we'll reset the numbers here, and once again we didn't gain much. I think the quality. I think the auto setting actually had it at either balanced or performance, so that's why we're not seeing that big an increase here. I mean, it is a little bit higher, so I think the auto setting was maybe set to balanced, right? So we're still not getting close to our 60 frames per second, and once again, as I said, it's definitely not a realistic expectation, but what I want to test is just how close we actually can get to it. Right, so we're just going to up the FSR to ultra performance, and now we're getting in the mid 50s, so definitely getting closer to that 60 frames per second number, but graphical fidelity is suffering quite a bit. There's definitely a big reduction in the visual quality by going to ultra performance. But then again, that makes sense because our internal resolution has been lowered quite a lot. Right, but this actually does feel very smooth or playable. You can see that our 1% and 0.1% low numbers are very close once again to our average FPS there. The frame time graph just below that is pretty smooth, so that would indicate a very consistent experience as well. So all in all, this is definitely not bad for such an old graphics card. As for whether I'd play at these settings, probably not. If I have to choose the best settings to play with this RX 580, I'd reckon 1080p with FSR on balanced would give you the best experience. Alright, and that's it for our testing at 1440p. I'm going to do one test at 4K, so 4K is definitely not a realistic expectation for this card, but I just want to see how this card actually performs at 4K native. Right, so now we're on 4K with our graphics setting once again to low, but with FSR disabled, and this doesn't look right at all. Okay, so apparently we can't play this game at 4K. Not sure. I'm just going to restart the game. Let's see what happens. Or I died. I'm lying on the ground, it seems. Right, and we're back. So yeah, we did die and the game glitched out. So not sure what happened there. So definitely Cyberpunk still has its bugs, even though they removed quite a few or fixed quite a few in the last 2 years. There are definitely still some bugs around, and as you can see, we're getting about 20 frames per second at 4K. This is actually commendable. I mean, I thought we would be getting like low teens, and definitely not playable. I wouldn't recommend to play at these settings at all, but just nice to know that it is actually maintaining about 20 frames per second at 4K native. This is not with FSR. I just double checked. So if you have an RX 580, I'd recommend 4K only for taking screenshots. Right, and then lastly, we are just going to see how close we can get to that 60 frames per second mark at 4K once again by just upping the FSR. And for this, we're just going to go straight to Ultra Performance. And as you can see, we're getting about 40 frames per second. It's pretty much what we got at 1440p with the FSR on Auto. So, I mean, it's definitely much better than 4K native. This is actually playable. So if you have a 4K monitor, you can utilize that. It just won't be a very high refresh rate experience. But once again, FSR is actually very impressive. I mean, sure, it does lower the visual quality quite a bit because it renders at a much lower internal resolution and then it upscales it to 4K, but it actually looks quite okay. One thing that we just need to check for is ghosting. So you'd see ghosting around the number plate area, or the tires as well. If we can actually just get past these cars, my driving leaves quite a lot to be desired. So if we drive a little bit faster, we should see some ghosting if it is present by the tires. You can see that the text is glitching quite a little bit, artifacting, especially the number plate, and just underneath the car there's quite a lot of lighting artifacting going on. But once again, can't really expect miracles, and FSR is actually doing a pretty good job, yeah. And it's not like the artifacting is visible enough to be extremely distracting. So once again, if you do have a 4K monitor, then this might actually be an okay option for you. And I'm pretty impressed getting 45 frames per second average at 4K with an RX 580. Even though we are using upscaling tech, it's actually pretty impressive. Alright, but I think I've taken up enough of your time, so I'm gonna call it right there. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.